If you've ever been tormented by thoughts, images, or urges that feel blasphemous and sinful and target your faith or morality, you're going to want to hear this episode. Today, we're talking about scrupulosity, also called religious OCD. I'm Samantha Bray, and this is OCD Insights. My guest today is Jaimie Eckert. Jaimie is a scrupulosity coach. She holds 3 theology degrees, including a doctorate. What makes Jaimie so special is that she does not just study this work, she has lived it. After a serious mental health episode while on a mission, she was diagnosed with religious OCD herself. And she's spent years since helping people untangle their faith from their fear. So if your mind has ever handed you a thought so disturbing that you wondered what it said about you, take a breath. You're not broken and you're not alone. Let's welcome Jaimie Eckert.
Welcome to OCD Insights, where we break down the complexities of OCD with compassion, clarity, and hope. Whether you're seeking answers, support, or a connection, you're not alone. So let's dive right in with our host, Samantha Bray. This is OCD Insights.
Hi, Jaimie. It's so good to meet you. Thank you for agreeing to be on OCD Insights. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a topic I enjoyed discussing.
I have a lot of notes here. I wanted to start by you have 3, is that right? 3 theology degrees, including a doctorate? Oh my
Yes.
gosh, you've dedicated your work to something I think most seminaries don't even teach. And I'm wondering, how did you first come to specialize in scrupulosity? And if you don't mind, could you tell a little bit about
Yeah,
your path?
absolutely. I never had an intention of ever doing this. Actually, I went to college initially to become a Bible teacher. So I double majored in education and biblical studies. Went as a missionary with my husband overseas. I was teaching at a mission school. They said, "Well, take another degree. You'll be even better of a teacher if you can do more." So I took a second degree. They gave me a scholarship for a third for my doctorate, which is actually in missiology, which is the study of Christian missions. Has nothing to
Okay.
do with scrupulosity at all.
Okay. Yeah.
I was very much into the mission sphere and sharing the gospel in, multicultural contexts. But it was in that context as an overseas missionary that I had a mental health breakdown.
Okay.
And that I had been struggling personally with depression and anxiety since I was a teenager. Never had an OCD diagnosis before because, as I'm sure we'll talk about in this podcast, scrupulosity is not the atypical presentation of what people think of when it comes to OCD. So it never even came across my radar, but it was in that breakdown when I flew back to the United States and had to do some time inpatient and was diagnosed with religious OCD. Went back to join my husband in where we lived overseas, and I did not really have I didn't have the best access to care. I was in a developing country, and there were not really a lot of therapists around, definitely nobody who understood OCD or scrupulosity. So during that time, I had been treated for my depression, and I was doing really good on that front. But as far as the OCD, I actually spent a lot of time in Facebook support groups. And I
Really?
was just, like, soaking up and learning from other people, what is this scrupulosity stuff all about? What do I do with this? How do I treat my OCD? And so I learned a lot from other people, just peer support. And as I
Wow.
was learning from them, the educator in me was like, you will learn things so much better when you teach it to other people. So I intentionally was, like, spending time then trying to support others in the forums that were struggling. And by and by, they started tagging me and they started direct messaging me and asking me for advice. And I was sort of at a point where my own OCD was stabilizing. And so I didn't have enough time to really help as many people as were reaching out to me unless I kind of made that more of a thing in my life. So it was in, I think, 2019 when I quit my work that I'd been doing with refugees and humanitarian stuff, and I became a scrupulosity coach.
Wow. Man, there's a lot there to unpack. I'm so curious. Like, wow, that must have been a big life decision to decide to quit your job to become a scrupulosity coach. That's amazing, man. Did you say that during your treatment for depression when you flew back to the States. That's where you were diagnosed. Was that the first time you had come to see that it was OCD?
Okay, so actually how I figured out it was OCD is a crazy part of the story too, and I don't know if this will resonate with any of your listeners, but I was like before I went was it yeah, it was before I flew back. I had a few times seen a telehealth therapist a
Mm,
few times, and she knew I was dealing with depression, and so she started me on CBT, basic cognitive behavioral therapy. If you have this bad thought, you argue with it and replace it with the correct thought. And she was
mm,
just gushing about how wonderful CBT is, and I think CBT is probably an umbrella term that can mean a lot of different things. I don't know if I'm even repeating it correctly, but she says this is a great modality. I prescribe it for everybody except people who have OCD because it can backfire on them. And it was just a conversation and we kept going because I mean, I don't have OCD. I never thought about OCD. OCD is for people who wash their hands a lot, right? People who check the lock on the door. I don't do that. I have I have a clean house, but it's not perfectly clean. So it didn't even cross my mind twice until I was fastidiously doing all of the mental argumentation with myself and I was getting worse.
Yeah.
I was watching myself become more neurotic every day as I would sit there and I would have a bad thought and I would argue with that thought and try to get it out and be like,
Yeah.
trying to fix my thoughts. And you're nodding and smiling because you know what was
yeah.
happening in my brain. I was getting worse from that mental ritualized
Yeah.
arguing. And it was at
Yeah.
that moment was the first time that her comment popped back in my mind. And I was like, she did say this can backfire on people with OCD. Google, what is OCD? And that was when I first started seeing myself in some of those symptom lists. And then I came across this idea that there is such a thing as religious OCD. And so when I flew back, I did two things. I stayed at a facility that specializes in like a holistic depression recovery
Yeah.
program. And I mean, thank God it was the best thing I've ever done in my life. In 10 days, my depression was completely cured. Since 2017, I've been depression free. I just thank God for that. But the second thing that I did is I said, I need to see an OCD specialist. So
Mhm.
I booked a session with somebody who all he did was OCD. And he listened to me for just a few minutes. He's like, yeah, you've got scrupulosity. So mystery solved.
Yeah. How did it feel to finally have a name for what you were going through?
It was it was at once reassuring and disorienting because it was like I suddenly have this wolf by the throat and now I can see it, but I don't know what to do with it. And it was a little, yeah, disorienting also to realize that I've got something that I didn't know I have.
I can imagine. That sounds like I listened to some of your teachings online, and one that was really great was about how you coined the 4 stages that you've seen people go through. And I see the same thing, but I had never put those words to it. And I think the first one was in unconscious incompetence. And so that kind of sounds like what you're describing. Like, you're now you're conscious, you're incompetent and
Right.
conscious of it.
So that the framework that you're describing, I actually learned that when I was in the facility for depression recovery, and they were
Okay.
teaching that to us as far as people who don't realize they're depressed, and then when we do
Yes.
realize, and it was being applied to that framework, and so I just kind of shifted it over to the world of
It
OCD.
works perfectly. So
Yeah,
would you mind
this
running
is
through that?
you don't realize that you have, and to be honest, Samantha, this is one of the things I would say, like if you were to ask me, Jaimie, as a scrupulosity coach, what is the biggest challenge that you have in
Yeah.
helping your clients? Moving a person from that unconscious
Mhm.
incompetence phase to
Yeah.
that breakthrough epiphany of realizing this is not God. This is not normal. This is something called OCD. Like that shift to that conscious incompetence stage. I don't know how to do that. And I can only say it's like a miracle that that can happen for a person to recognize that this is not normal, what's happening to me. There has to be a psychological explanation for what I thought was a religious experience. It's a very difficult step to take.
Yes, that's where we gauge when we first meet a therapist that specializes in OCD, that first meets someone, we're kind of looking at how much insight they have. And like you said, when they have 0 to none, it's a bit challenging to move that needle right there. But there are ways that it happens. Sometimes I think it is miraculous, though, really.
Mhm.
It does feel that way. But I think a lot of psychoeducation can help, and an understanding how the mind works with OCD and anxiety and how that fear and everything comes to evolve. But scrupulosity is a very unique subtheme, in my opinion, where we're dealing with not so much tangible things, right? You're thinking of the spiritual realm and talking about God. And if we're talking about a doubting disease where so much is uncertain, holy moly, that's like a whole nother layer. Gosh, if we start from the ground, how would you describe or define scrupulosity in your own words for someone that's never heard about it before?
Yeah, so I always like to say scrupulosity is a mental health disorder hijacking my relationship with God. And there's this a merging of obsessive compulsive tendencies with my religious behaviors, rituals, and mindsets. And of course, as you know, this can apply across any religious group or denomination. It's not something that is necessarily based on whether you have quote unquote healthy or unhealthy theology. Like I see a lot of people who have the best theological view of God, very
Mm,
healthy, very loving, very compassionate, not a
okay.
toxic view of God. And they've got all kinds of religious compulsions and obsessions, right? So
Mm.
this is something that I've seen across the board with different religious denominational backgrounds, but it is essentially where a person has obsessive compulsive disorder and it is attaching to their religious experience.
That's spot on to how I would describe it too. I do see that sometimes people fall into that category, even if they don't feel or self identify as being religious or having a particular religion. They still have somehow absorbed the idea of good and evil, right and wrong. They have the sense of morality. And um, even if they haven't explicitly said they are a certain religion and follow a certain religiosity, they can get caught up in doing things perfectly or right or good or, having some magical thinking around things in hopes that they end up in the good place or they can reunite with maybe family members that are now in heaven or whatnot. But one thing about scrupulosity that kind of has confused me over the years, and I'm wondering if you've experienced this, I have had people, at least two, from different countries that came over here, maybe in their teens to the States, are not Christians, do not follow Christianity, but had blasphemous thoughts around Jesus in particular that really crippled them, even though they were not identified as Christians. I always found that to be interesting. Have you ever experienced that before?
Yeah, you're actually making me think of a client that I once had from the Czech Republic. And Czech Republic is one of the world's most atheist nations.
Okay.
The rate of people that prescribe to any specific religion is very low in that country. And I had a young man reach out to me that he was having a lot of obsessions about Jesus. And, with OCD, it's the what if always. It's the what if about everything. And for him, it was, well, I'm atheist, but what if God does exist? And so it was just another twist on what if I'm getting this wrong? And it actually is a different way than my worldview and my belief system tells me it is. And so I've seen things like that. I've seen where people, Muslims, for example,
Yes.
I've been in correspondence with some of them where, they're having these crazy blasphemous thoughts against Allah, but then they'll get an intrusive thought saying, worship Jesus. And that's opposed to their religious system because Muslims believe that Jesus was a prophet, not, the son of God. And so for a Muslim, that's a very scary and negative thought to have something go through their mind saying, I want to worship Jesus. Now, if you were to talk to a pastor or an evangelist who's not familiar with scrupulosity, they would probably say, brother, your conscience is convicting you, and would probably like
Mm.
encourage them to convert to Christianity if they're having a thought like this.
Oh,
But this is not what's happening in their mind. It's not what I would ever call true conviction. It is an obsessive compulsive response to thoughts that are opposed to their belief system. And so I've seen when people do take these individuals and try to preach at them and encourage some sort of, forward movement. And of course, I'm a Christian. So part of my whole mission in life is to, show people the loveliness of Jesus. And, if I can do something to help them come to see Jesus as their Lord and Savior, that's like, for me, amazing. But OCD is not the time and place to twist a person's, the thoughts that they're having. Like, this is not a conversation about conversion. First and foremost, we want this person to be in a healthy mental state. And they may never, ever, confess Christ. But having an intrusive thought, I need to worship Jesus or I should worship God, we have to see, is this really a place of conviction or is this a mental health disorder? And I believe that a person, whatever religion they belong to, we can come to know God better when our brain is healthy.
Yeah.
And so I always talk, but this is just a side note here. I often have people with scrupulosity. I think I'm going on a tangent here. You can pull me back if necessary. But I often have people that have these sort of gray area issues in their spiritual life. And they're like, well, I don't know. What does the Bible say about this or that? And they're trying to figure out, like, is God okay with me doing this hobby or pursuing this, girlfriend or whatever? And when I'm seeing that they're cogitating on it from an intensely ritualistic, obsessive mindset, I have to stop them. I'm like, you know what? I have an opinion on this as a Christian, right? But I'm not going to tell you what my opinion is. We're not going to do a Bible study on this right now because the bigger issue isn't what's the right and wrong thing to do. The bigger issue is your mental pattern right now. And the Bible talks about, Paul wrote to Timothy, he says, look, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And there's this idea in scripture that God wants us to be in our sound mind, to renew our mind, to heal our mind. And that has to come before we can really even solidify and understand, what does God want me to do in these small areas where I'm trying to figure it out? I have
Yes.
to learn how to be in my sound mind first. And so sometimes I find it more important to delay when I'm working with the client. I'm like, we need to delay making a decision on whether this thing is right or wrong, because if I just tell you this is right or this is wrong, your OCD is just going to jump to a different theme. And we're not really going to get to. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, that was kind of a roundabout.
No, that's beautiful. I mean, it's a lot there that I'd love. I mean, I'd be on here 3 hours with you if we unpacked all that. But it's similar to how, in my mind, I feel like Dan Siegel's work on the brain, they flip their lid and they basically go offline and they're narrow focused on, I got to fix this one thing. And you're saying, actually, you need to regulate your nervous system, bring your mind back to a calm state before you can see the big picture and
Right.
actually approach this, from a more rational point of view.
Right.
That hijacking the brain, that's the way you put that. That's what I think of, where if I really think of it from, a lot of my clients I've seen over the years don't want to talk in religious terms, and I am not a religious expert. So if they do belong to a religion, I always suggest that they bring trusted religious leader into the conversation here so that they can be supported on that side, on the spiritual side. And one thing I hear people ask sometimes is they talk about, like, is this spiritual warfare? What is going on that I'm getting so caught up in the weeds that my focus is so narrow? I can't serve my community. I can't be in relationship with other people. What do you think about that?
What do I think about spiritual warfare? Thank you for asking me that question, because I think I have a lot of opinions on this. This actually represents another roadblock that we have, that we see frequently I work specifically with Christians with scrupulosity. So I see this a lot in my sphere, is this idea that what I'm dealing with is a spiritual battle. And my philosophy to this is, yes, I do believe that at some level, because we're spiritual beings, everything could be, in a way, explained as a spiritual experience or a spiritual battle in some way.
Right.
But to really personalize it and create this idea or narrative that, like, there's a demon trying to attack you, or there's a demon standing over your shoulder, or God is testing you by these different trials, I think is probably an overextension of what's actually happening. What I see is happening, especially when a person does have a clear OCD diagnosis, is that we are experiencing a psychological problem and we're trying to explain it with spiritual terms. And some people have called that spiritual bypassing. There's different terms that have been used to say, like, we are putting the wrong explanation or the wrong cure on this problem. I remember I had a client once, he was dealing with the blasphemous thoughts, of course, which is the first one that people jump on and say this is demonic. And
Okay.
so his friends had all encouraged him to go to this deliverance ministries retreat. And this guy spent, like, I don't remember if it was like one or two or $3,000 to go to a deliverance retreat where, these specialists sat in a circle around him and prayed over him and said they were casting demons out of him. And I mean, I'm kind of more of a conservative Christian, and I know there's a lot of different beliefs out there about demonology. Actually, isn't that interesting? In seminary, there's an actual sphere called demonology of people who
Really?
actually study this stuff. My seminary didn't, but I know that there's some denominations that really get into that. Yeah, and they were trying to cast out the demon of OCD, the demon of this,
Mhm.
the demon of that, the demon of blasphemy. And at first, the client I was working with, at first he was like so relieved and felt so good. And of course, you know how that works. When a
Yeah.
person with OCD is getting somebody pouring into them and they're getting reassurance, the reassurance does feel so good for like 2 hours.
Right,
So
like that much time.
so initially he felt so good while he was at the retreat. Like, I'm gonna have victory. The Lord has power in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he left the retreat a few $1,000s lighter, and he goes home and he has his first blasphemous thought after leaving. And you can imagine what that did to him. It just knocked
Yes.
him hopeless. And he's
Right.
thinking, like, they did all of that, and the demon is still with me. It must mean that I'm incurable. It must mean that I'm lost, that I'm completely given over to demons. And when I
Yeah.
saw him, the poor guy was so convinced that he was hopeless because this experience of labeling a psychological issue with a spiritual label had convinced him otherwise. And so it was really difficult to make headway with him. And I think that it's a dangerous thing when we market it as something that it isn't.
I really appreciate you explaining that so beautifully. Can you, for people that maybe haven't heard the term blasphemous thoughts, explain what that could look like?
Yeah. So, one of the features in religious OCD, which is not universal, I always remind people that scrupulosity, like any other OCD theme, has kind of what I call symptom clusters. Some people really struggle with doubts. Am I saved or not? Some people have those moralistic, oh no, did I cheat on my taxes? Did I lie to my neighbor?
Yes.
Some of those moralistic cluster of obsessions. And then there's people that really struggle with intrusive thoughts. And I would say one of the most common flavors of intrusive thoughts when you have religious OCD is what we call blasphemous thoughts, where you can get very inappropriate thoughts, feelings, or even urges against God. And of course, this is context dependent on, the person's denomination. So I see frequently Roman Catholics will have bad thoughts against the Virgin Mary. Evangelicals and other Protestants will have Catholics as well, bad thoughts against Jesus or against God. I've worked with Hindus before that will get terrible thoughts against the gods that they have in their religion. So of course it's context dependent. But whoever you venerate as being holy and righteous and like the God worthy of your worship or devotion, you get terrible thoughts. And I always remind this to my clients because people think, well, what do you mean? What do you mean when you say intrusive thoughts?
Right.
For me, I use that as kind of an umbrella term to describe images that flash into your mind that are
Yes.
disrespectful, sometimes sexual in nature in a
Yep.
very inappropriate way.
Right.
It can be words like blasphemous words or cuss words or
Mm.
rejection type language against
Mm.
God. It can also be emotions. A person can have an intrusive emotion of of feeling of hatred towards God. And then what do? They're like, why did I just have that feeling of hatred and anger towards God? Where did that come from? Maybe I really am reprobate. So it can be
Mhm.
emotion and it can also be urges where people are getting urges and you've probably seen this in your practice where people talk about how I have these bad words against Jesus and it's like they're on the tip of my tongue and I have literally an urge to say them. And I always, this is getting maybe too deeper than you want to get. So feel free to edit this part out if you want. But something that I've reminded some of my clients about when they talk about these urges and emotions that are so disturbing, I always say to them, I say, look, this is weird, but there is a theme in OCD called sexual OCD. Nobody likes to talk about it, but it exists. It's there. And people who have sexual intrusive thoughts about inappropriate individuals or ages or whatever it may be, sometimes these people will have something that the OCD world calls the groinal response, where their physical biology actually creates a biological response as if there's a sexual arousal. And they don't want that. They get freaked out about that too, because they're like understanding how inappropriate it is. And I tell them, I say, look, if a person with sexual OCD can have that happening in their body due to an intrusive thought, how much more will a person with religious OCD also have urges to say something or feelings about whatever this inappropriate thought is? And I had a client one time when I explained that to her, she's like, oh my goodness, I never realized that. So you mean when I have these bad urges towards God and I feel like I actually want it, I might not? And I'm like, no, this sounds like OCD to me.
Absolutely. That's a really great point. Glad you brought that up. Yeah, that's a real common thing. And when I explain to folks what the diagnostic criteria is for OCD, and it is a combination of intrusive thoughts, perceived urges is what I say, and or thoughts. Like 10% of folks have images according to the research. But I refuse to say urges these days, and I always say they need to change that in the DSM and make it perceived urges, because
I like that.
it's what you're saying. It's when we have a thought, we do not want something or do not want to do something, our mind has to think about the something or the verb, the doing of something first. And immediately, if it is a threat at all, if it is a fear at all, our body automatically, involuntarily starts to go through the motions of fixing it. So it's like kind of like itch scratch. You have an itch and your body is going to scratch it before you realize, oh, wait, that's that wound I'm not supposed to scratch. You already are driven in since the motors started, but it doesn't mean you actually want to do that thing. Right? Because it's I don't ever want to have that thought or do that thing. And then it makes you then misinterpret the physiological response that's happening in your body as proof that you actually do want to do it. And then you want to hold back. And that's the compulsion.
Right.
And the compulsion then feeds that loop saying, whenever you have that thought, do the compulsion to feel safe. So you feel like you're constantly pulling yourself back from saying the thing or doing the thing that you don't want to do. But it's not really an urge. This is not an impulse control disorder.
Right.
It's an over control disorder.
Right.
But those urges are so scary to people. I'm so glad that you know about that and you're spreading that word. That's awesome.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, definitely bridge a gap between religious professionals and therapists. I feel that when I saw your website, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to her. If I had known you weren't around when I first started. You started in did you say 19 or 18 during this?
2019.
Thank goodness, because this is definitely a gap that has been needed to be filled. And I'm really going off script of all the questions that I had for you, because it is so easy to speak with you and you're just saying all the things that I was hoping to hear about. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, you almost started to talk about, I think, is thought action fusion and your specific description of that and how it works in the realm that scrupulosity realm.
Okay. So thought action fusion, I don't always use the therapist terminology in my work, but really what you're talking about is, if I understand you correctly, is so I have a thought and that thought is so compelling that I think it was like the real me. And so I behave as though that was me. I behave as though that was a threat. Is that how you're using the term?
Well, that's definitely one good avenue to go down and talk about. And the additional piece is if we just have a thought, like I have a client that often will say they have a thought of, and you name it something else too, when parasitic, what is the term you use whenever you seek reassurance to make yourself feel better?
Yeah, reassurance seeking is very parasitic. Yeah.
Okay. So it's in that realm where someone might have a quote, bad thought, like say they don't like the new haircut their spouse came home with, and they have a thought, ooh, I don't really like that. And then they feel like they have to tell, and they want to ask even me, is that a bad thought that I had? And do I need to say anything? And it could be something really minuscule, like a haircut gone wrong, or it could be I saw someone at the grocery store I thought was attractive. Is that bad? Do I need to tell my spouse? So in that realm, how would you help someone in those situations? How might you guide them or explain what's going on?
Yeah, so from the scrupulosity and more the biblical side of the approach, we do talk about, I think you would talk about ego syntonic and ego dystonic thoughts. We talk about that from the biblical aspect as well, that not every thought that you think is actually linked with the real you. And many, specifically many Christians, have that assumption because of some of the teachings. For example, one of the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, if you look at a woman to lust for her, you have already committed adultery with her in your heart. So there can be this assumption that what Jesus meant was having a thought equals the action itself. However, when we go a layer deeper into that teaching that we find in the book of Matthew, Jesus says, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her. Within the language itself is this implication that you're looking in order to experience something lustful, that there's an intentionality, there is a direct meaning behind it. And so I would take that passage and I would apply that to viewing pornography. That is
Mm-hmm.
an activity somebody sits down with the intent of looking in order to have a lustful experience. I worked with a client one time that was absolutely paralyzed by this idea that he might accidentally see a woman who was attractive and experience lust for her and sin. And he was married, so he felt very bad for his wife throughout this whole thing. This man was a very high achieving man. He had previously worked in one of the European countries, I can't remember which one, for the Secret Service of that country. He had come over to the US, was now a high ranking banker at a prestigious bank. Like he was we're not talking about like crazy people. These are
Yeah.
life
No. Mhm.
intelligent people, right? And this guy was paralyzed with this obsession to the
Yeah.
point that he could not turn on his television in case the news anchor had like a shirt with a low cut blouse. He could not
Yes.
go to the supermarket because, he might see a woman there. Even in his work, he was really suffering that if there were female clients that would come to him, he would shake their hand without looking at them. And he
Yes.
was taking this, I think you would say, the thought action fusion type of interpretation of Jesus' teachings and thinking, if I see any woman that even tickles my brain with the idea of body parts,
Mm-hmm.
if I even notice anything, then it equals lust and I'm living in sin. And I have to confess to my wife, I have to confess to God. And of course, with scrupulosity, confession can take a really long and painful time. So it was really shrinking his life and what he was able to do and to experience. And so we spent some time talking about, that teaching of Jesus and other teachings as well, where Jesus is not saying noticing something or having a thought pass through your mind is sinful, but it's when intentionality is connected to the action, when you mean it, when it becomes that ego syntonic part of you so central to your belief system that you're like, no, this is the real me. I agree with this. I want this. I like this. And none of the people that are dealing with scrupulosity would ever say that. I always
No.
ask the question when a person is struggling with something like this, I say, let me ask you a question. Would you take this thought and make a bumper sticker out of it and put it on your car for the world to see? And the reaction is always like, no, I would never do that. Okay, there you go. It's clearly not something
That's a
that you're
good.
proud of, not something that you enjoy or want. And so it's really not what Christ was talking about when we have all these different teachings about sin and our will and things like that.
I wonder, I mean, do you often work with people or do you ever work with someone that actually doesn't feel or profess to be a Christian, but has these types of thoughts and knows that this might be an avenue that could help them? I know that's a leap of a question, but I have so many clients running through my head right now that are not religious, that
Right.
are dealing with very similar situations.
Right.
And I don't know if it would be comforting for them to hear of a major world religion that has some explanation for this. I mean, I'm not sure if, it's a confusing topic for people that are dealing with moral things and scruples, I guess, but they
Mhm.
don't follow any kind of religious path.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I have had clients in the past that are not professing Christians. Maybe they're atheist or they're from another religious background. I will say, like in my own work with Scrupulosity, I have been very open that I'm a Christian. This is my belief system. And I really lean heavily on the Bible as sort of our textbook for ideas and thoughts and teachings that can help us move to a healthier place. Um, I I think that the strongest approach to scrupulosity recovery is interdisciplinary. I think that if a person
Mhm.
is working, as you've mentioned before, if they have an OCD therapist that understands the psychological side of things, which I'm not prepared to deal with, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a medical professional, and somebody, a faith leader that understands the religious side of things. And if those two approaches can merge together, kind of like this conversation that we're having right now, I view that as the best scaffolding and support for a person to get better. With that being said, as you're mentioning, not everybody comes from a Christian background. So what then? Ideally, they would be able to find help in whatever sphere they're in. But you're right. Maybe it can also be helpful for non-religious or people from a different religious background to just like take a look and see, well, what does the Christian gospel have to say about this? I remember
Yeah.
I have a weekly group coaching session. Twice per week, we have like a bunch of people come together in a group on Zoom. And we had a Hindu guy join us one time. And of course, Hindus are very open to all different religions. They're very pluralistic in their outlook. And so for him, it wasn't like a big deal to be hearing different Christian concepts. But he joined our group for a while, and he says, "Look, I am not a Christian, but the way you're talking about God is so comforting, and it just helps so much to be able to like reshape the mind the way it needs to be shaped." And so that was really nice to hear from
Oh,
him
yeah.
to see that, oh, it's not just professing Christians who can find a benefit in this. But I do believe the Bible has some core concepts that whoever you are, like, there's healing in it. It's a very
Yeah.
healing book when it's understood correctly.
I got chills on that. That's important for people to hear that open your mind. You could get some wisdom and comfort if even if you don't profess to be a Christian or have much knowledge about it.
Right.
Just, it could be helpful to be in a group such as yours if you're dealing with situations and thoughts like this that like we're describing. I wonder about you talk about scripture. What are some of the most powerful parts of scripture that seem to help click for people? Like I think of I don't even know what exact scripture it is, but the one about taking thoughts captive. That always pops into my head when I'm talking to people. I'm
Oh
like,
my god.
you need to put this in a bubble and put it on a shelf and then deal with that, not what's inside the bubble. That's how I envision the captivity of a thought. How do you see what kind of scripture like that is
Oh my
helpful?
goodness, Samantha, as soon as you started asking your question, that passage came in my mind, even before you
Wild.
just how wild is that, right? So let me give one little framework statement here, and then I wanna go to that passage because it's so, so, so good. So the framework of the gospel, and this is really the essence, what Christians believe is that I'm pretty helpless in and of myself. I actually need a power outside of myself to give me the strength that I need for whatever it is that I need to do, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that part itself is already very healing to a person with OCD. I talk a lot about this idea of surrendering outcomes to God, not insisting that I have to have things just this way, because OCD wants us, it's very protective disorder. Like we try to protect outcomes, we try to force things to be just the way. Like I want to, make sure my house doesn't burn down. That's why I'm going to keep checking the oven. I'm forcing this outcome. And so really the gospel says, I don't actually know what things will happen in my life, but I trust a power outside of myself to take care of me and to make sure things are going to go okay, even if outcomes don't go the way I think they should. And
Right.
so
Okay.
that sort of framework of putting my trust in God and saying, I'm not the one in control of my life. I don't have to ritualize and do all these compulsions to protect and control myself. I can let go and let God take care of me. This is, I believe, really the essence of the gospel message itself, what we believe as Christians, trusting a higher power to be the one taking care of me. With that being said, You go through all the different teachings of Christianity, how to be a good person, how to have forgiveness of your sins, how to like anything that you talk about as far as like what the Christian life looks like. If we understand the Bible correctly, it's going to be in any way explained by God's power working in me. We don't believe that he's leaving us to like figure it out for ourselves. He's doing it for me. He's the one that sent Jesus to die so my sins could be forgiven. He's the one that empowers me through his Holy Spirit to do good things. I can't do anything good on my own. Like I'm a selfish person, right? So
Okay.
this idea of God helping me, God taking care of me, I'm just a little baby in his arms. I don't have to take care of myself. That's the gospel. So when you come to the passage you talked about, that's 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And 2 Corinthians 10 is actually a major sticking point that trips up a lot of people with religious OCD. And let me tell you how they interpret it. They read it and they say, oh, this passage says that I have to take every thought captive and bring every thought into captivity to Christ. And I have to cast down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. And they're like, that means I have to argue against my bad thoughts. Literally, like 100% of people with scrupulosity that I've ever heard that verse come out of their mouth, that's how they're interpreting it.
That's how they interpret it.
They're saying, my therapist is telling me to ignore the thoughts, but I can't do it because this verse tells me not to. And I say, hold up, guys. Let's look at the context of the verse. Let's do a correct exegesis. Back up to verse 1, 2, and 3 before we get to the other verses, right? And what you see in the verses that come before that is that the Apostle Paul, he often described this sort of dichotomy between flesh and spirit. And, there's your flesh where you're kind of doing things on your own. And then there's a spirit where you're living in the spiritual realm of, I'm God's child. He's taking care of me. I have a living union with the divine. He is, living his life through me, through the spirit. That's different from living in the flesh, right? So before those problematic verses, he's like, look, we live in the flesh, in a fleshly body, but we don't walk in the flesh. We live in the spirit. And he says, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. What does this mean, carnal? It means they're not human and fleshly. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God. For the pulling down of strongholds, for bringing every thought into captivity. And when you read the context, it completely turns the equation on its head. And it's a reminder that if you want thought control in your life, as a Christian, if you want to bring every thought into captivity, don't try to do it in a carnal, fleshly way in your own human power. Don't forget the gospel. It's God taking care of you. It's the mighty weapons of his warfare. And people go kind of crazy when I make this exegesis for them. And they're like, well, what does this mean? Am I supposed to just depend on God to take care of my thoughts? I'm like, yeah. Let's just try it, right? Let's just try. I'm not ignoring the thought and saying, I don't care about the thought. Right. Of course we care about it. We're Christians. We care about these things. We're disturbed by them. I'm ignoring it because I trust that there's somebody who's going to take care of it for me. And ignoring the thought is actually a statement of faith in what God can do in my life. So that's kind of how I interpret that verse. And I found it really useful in tackling some of these intrusive thoughts and how we respond to them.
Yeah, I've never heard it explained that way. I appreciate that. And then there's also the one around, I think it's a Corinthians verse around, think on these things that are true, noble, necessary. What's that scripture?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you know the one I'm thinking of?
I'm gonna look at it for you. It's
Philippians
4, I think. Okay.
That one's come up before, and I actually like that one. Yeah, if you can read it, that'd be great.
Okay, so the verse you're thinking of is Philippians 4:8. I'll read it from the New King James Version. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report. If there's any virtue and if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. So excellent verse about the content of our thought lives. And I do see that as the goal. I think as Christians with OCD, we can often confuse process with goal. And we think, well, because the goal is there, the daily process leading up to the goal has to be the same. And so because God has told me to think about good and lovely and worthwhile things, then at any point in the process in which I'm changing, If I think about something bad, then I'm completely failing him. But we know when we compare with other passages, like in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, it talks about we are renewing our minds. And there's this idea that, like, my mind is not what it's supposed to be. Like, I'm a work in progress. So, what is it? Was it Philippians chapter 1 talks about how he who began a good work in me is going to be faithful to complete it. That means I'm not complete yet. I'm a work in progress. I'm half baked. And how healing is it to just embrace the idea that, yeah, I'm half baked and that's okay because God loves me anyways, right? I don't have to. It really is so opposed to that perfectionism that underlies so much of religious OCD. And so when you read a passage like Philippians 4:8, that's the goal. Of course, God wants us to have purity of thought. But in the process of getting there, does God have mercy for me? If I have a truly bad thought or if I have an ego dystonic intrusive thought, like whatever the source is, whether I meant the bad thought or whether I didn't mean the bad thought, does God have mercy for me as I'm in the process of learning to be his disciple and learning to reflect his goodness in my life?
I love that. I see that that verse in my world. Side note, where did psychology and therapy modalities come from? I mean, I've never done a deep dive and researched that, but as I've learned world religions and studied a little bit deeper in a few things and practiced meditating and read all the books I was assigned to read, I feel like so many of the nuggets that have worked in the therapy I do with my clients have come from some old religious text. Could be any of them, and all of them, they pull from these nuggets. Like that verse to me is where I explain, look at the outcome picture, the living of a valued centered life. You can look at modalities like acceptance and commitment therapy, things where, ideas where you look at the values that you hold dear, and that is where you put your eyes whenever OCD intrusive thoughts start to hijack you and make and tell you you should come over here and do this compulsion. You pause on that and raise your eyes up to that outcome picture, those values. And so that would be like how you're saying that's the goal, like the overarching spiritual goal. And that, but along the way, we're learning and we're tripping and we're constantly like having to reset. And okay, is the choice to go down this road and do a compulsion, or is the choice to do the thing that's in line with my goals that's going to require me to put that thought on the shelf, take it captive, and do the thing that I know is fruitful? And that's another way. I mean, that's a total spiritual term that I constantly use, and I don't mean it in a religious way, but I'm like, is the response to that thought gonna bear fruit or not? I mean, most of the time people can tell it's going to take them in circles like the dog chasing its tail.
Right.
And then also really explaining, it's just really interesting how religion, I think, can help inform a lot of the therapeutic modalities that we use. And we're not even talking about anything having to do with religion. So interesting. Back a couple examples ago, you mentioned I think the person that had gone to the retreat to get the demons cast out, and then they come back, and then of course they're back in their regular environment, and then intrusive thought comes back. That piece, how do you help people when they're feeling so much shame and they blame it on themselves? They say OCD tends to make clients that I see want to do therapy perfectly, and you have to warn against anything that you're sharing that's a tool that could help you. You're going to do it softly, and you're not going to do it in response to an anxious thought. You're doing it like you would go to the gym to lift weights, to practice getting stronger. So when those moments that you need those muscles come up, you have them at your ready. But be cautious of turning any kind of tool or so a way of helping you get better, turning it into a compulsion. And so when someone comes home from a retreat like that and then has a thought and they think, I'm not doing it right, I didn't do it right, I didn't give it my all, or something's fundamentally wrong with me, I'm wondering, is there any scripture or any kind of way you could help people make sense of that it's not that they're broken?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. I feel like there's like three questions in one with that one.
Yeah, sorry.
But let me see. I have so many things I want to respond back on that. Yeah, so the shame-based aspect. There definitely is an aspect here where we're not gonna do things perfectly. And I regularly tell people I like to use the word gently. I say, "Look, guys, let's do this really gently because Jesus is gentle with us. We wanna be gentle with our own brains as well." And so anytime that I introduce some kind of a technique or tool or something, I will often make the caveat. I'll be like, "Okay, think about this or work with this tool, but do it really gently. And if you feel yourself starting to get compulsive about it, just drop it for a while." Because we can all get, as you said, we can all get compulsive even using the very best tools. I think a good example of that is when I talk about God distortions, that many of my clients have what I call God distortions of some kind of a twisted, warped view of God and his expectations for us. And this is a complicated area of the spiritual side of recovery that I think requires a lot of gentleness and slow, calm, like let's not get compulsive or obsessive about this. But there are so many different ways in which our skewed version of God is actually feeding the OCD cycle. So we believe a certain thing about God, that he expects the impossible from me, that he wants me to be perfect every single moment, that he's a God like my parents. I'm projecting my parents onto God and that he's just going to abandon me if I do the wrong thing. And so this feeds that threat and that danger that we're attaching with the OCD,
Mhm.
right? I had a client one time, he was such a lovely person. He had Lou Gehrig's disease, and I actually worked with him in the last 6 months or so of his life before he passed away. He was such a lovely person, and it was interesting because I was reading some research about Lou Gehrig's disease that said that everybody with ALS is such a nice person, that the people who treat ALS actually like talk about it between each other. And I read this one case study where a guy came in for testing for ALS and he was just like this rude, cranky, grumpy guy. And the researchers or the doctors looked at each other and they privately said, he doesn't have ALS. He's not nice enough. And lo and behold, his test results came back negative for ALS. And so there's kind of this idea with about ALS that they're like, there's just this lovely people, very kind. Um, and I found that to be true about this guy as well. But what I saw is that the niceness was actually him repressing so many normal feelings and normal emotions. And as we talked about it, we started talking about, what's your family background? Obviously, he had a lot of obsessive compulsive tendencies he had evangelism compulsions, which is a whole category where even when he would go to the hospital, he would feel like he had to preach to people or otherwise God was going to be disappointed with him and so on. And I said, what's your family like when you were growing up? And I make a long story short here, but he expressed that he had always been the good kid, behaving well, like nice personality, living up to everyone's expectations. And one day he heard his mom talking about him. And he heard his mom say, "Yeah, my son, so and so, he's the perfect kid. He is so like I never have to correct him. I've never punished him. He's like the perfect child." And something kind of happened in his heart where he said, "I never want to let my mom down. I can't let my mom down." And so that started him on this life of repressing normal emotions, of trying to be the perfect kid, trying to do everything right. And so he had taken that as an adult, he had projected that from his mom onto God. And when we were talking about this in one of our sessions, he suddenly stopped, and as you can imagine, his speech was very much impeded at this point. It was beautiful to hear him say this because I could tell that it was so life-changing for him to realize. And he says, "Oh my goodness, I have created God in the image of my mother." And it was at the end of that session when, we'd had this pattern every time that I would ask him, "How you doing?" And he's, in a wheelchair, hooked up to different machines. And, the good boy part of him would say, "I'm doing great. Praise the Lord." End of that session, I said, "How you feeling now?" He said, "I guess I can be honest now. I'm feeling pretty crummy." And it was just like the symbolic moment of, I don't have to be perfect. I can say how I'm really feeling. And even God doesn't expect me to be this impossible perfectionistic type of thing. And it was wonderful to see his journey. And one of his close friends emailed me after he passed away and said that his wife wanted to thank you because you helped him have peace in the last months of his life. And I think that's a powerful thing that can happen when we face those God distortions and we say, God's not like that. This is coming from a source other than from God. And then we can sort of snip the tie between that false idea of God that's been feeding into our OCD, right? But that's an example of something that, dealing with some of these distortions is an example of something we have to do gently. It's a tricky thing because I have seen other people, and I always, when I ask people these kinds of questions, I'm like, okay, you may or may not have something to dig into here. Like if there's nothing there, we don't need to go down this road too far. We don't want to get obsessive about this, but let's talk about your family, your history, how you grew up viewing God. Was your church healthy or toxic? This kind of thing. Because I've seen people that they're like, well, maybe there is something. Maybe there is something. Let me dig further. Let me dig. Well, maybe I was abused. Maybe I was traumatized. And it's like, no, hold on a second. We, we don't need to, go to that extent if there's nothing that's actually there. And I'm not a trauma therapist, right? Like that's not my specialty either. But you're absolutely right. We have to go gently and try to help them not turn these kinds of tools and techniques into compulsions.
That's a really good example. Ooh, it brought up a lot of thoughts for me. Okay. So this, as comfortable as you feel talking about it, I'm curious. When I first started treating OCD back in 20, I think 13 or 14 is whenever I first started really studying it and doing trainings and things. The gold standard is exposure and response prevention. And I had also gone to a few conferences around mental health and religion, mental health and spirituality, because it interested me. And that is when I was made aware that some ERP therapists are actually asking clients to do exposures that are not in alignment with their beliefs. And for example, if the man you had talked about was afraid of turning on the news reporter because she might be wearing something a little revealing, he had that fear, right? So an ERP therapist one that's maybe not trained or very versed in what we're talking about, maybe would have them look at women with themselves exposed and stuff like that. I was blown away that that was actually occurring. And this was years ago, right? Like 10 or so years ago. Hopefully people aren't doing so much of that now, but I wonder if you've run across people that have tried ERP and had a pretty rocky experience, or it just didn't work for them. I think ERP is a very good modality. I don't want to knock it. I don't want to split. I don't want to say that's bad and this is good, but I want the world to hear that there's probably a more appropriate way to use ERP, and there are other methods that might be better for folks with this type of theme.
Yeah.
What do
Yeah.
you
Okay.
what is your experience with the ERP? Bad ERP, good ERP?
I have so many thoughts on this. So I have this masterclass where I talk about like here are some steps what we need to do, and I suggest in there three kind of big categories that I think can be really really helpful, and I just kind of phrase it as like this. I say remove what's hurting you, acclimate to what's hurting you, or ignore what's hurting you until it goes away. And when I say remove what's hurting you, I see that there are some clients, as like the last case study that I shared, that they really do have some baggage that's feeding into their OCD, that through, a good biblical counselor or a therapist or a trauma, informed therapist, you need to remove that out of you and forgive and work through the memories and move on. I say also acclimate to what's hurting you. That's ERP. I think if a person with OCD can get a good sensitive, religiously sensitive therapist, ERP can be fantastic. I don't administer ERP. I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, but I can see the value because so many people with OCD, it's almost like we have really thin skin. We're very sensitive, and a small threat feels like a really big threat.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
It's
there's
called
this.
sensitization. It's like you're down to the live wire,
Right.
you know.
Right.
Yeah.
So I do see that as one of my 3 core suggestions that I make for people, and then, ignore what's hurting you till it goes away,
Say the 3 again.
is to remove what's hurting you. That's specifically for people that have, you know, God distortions, traumas, background baggage that's feeding into
Okay.
the themes that they're experiencing. Acclimate to what's hurting you. That's
Mhm.
ERP.
Yes.
And I think a person with religious OCD, even if they don't have a therapist, they can acclimate to things and say, I'm scared to death to go to church right now, but I'm going to go to church anyways. Right. And then you
Yes.
have just ignore the pain that or whatever's hurting you until it goes away by itself. And that's the whole concept of like, let's not tinker with this thought. Like if you just leave it alone, it's probably going to go away by tomorrow. And that's a whole sphere we probably don't have time to talk about. But when it comes to ERP, as I said, I do think this can be really helpful in many, but maybe not all cases of religious OCD. I would say in my work with Scrupulosity, there's an overwhelmingly negative slant towards ERP amongst Christians with OCD. Many of them have tried ERP and have experienced exactly what you said, an uninformed or an insensitive therapist telling them to do things that they really felt violated their belief system. And so I come across that idea all the time. And so it is a little bit of a chore to say, like, hey, maybe you didn't get the right therapist the first time around. You might need to try 2 or 3, maybe even 4 times different therapists until you find a good one that really fits and understands you well. But I've had clients that have been asked to rip pages out of their Bible to create scripts telling themselves, I'm going to hell, I'm lost, God hates
Mm.
me. I've had clients, I had one that her therapist asked her to look at videos of men having erections, like all kinds of things, saying the blasphemous thoughts out loud towards God.
Right.
And as you're saying, there are definitely exposures that are inappropriate because
Mhm.
there's 2 things to consider here. There is, yes, this person has fears that are in many cases, they're irrational fears, but
Mhm.
this person also has a belief system. And if we violate that belief system in trying to help them get better, there's 2 issues here. First of all, they're going to bail on you, and there's a high dropout rate. You probably know the statistics off the top of your head. But there's a high dropout rate for OCD therapy because people, of course, it's uncomfortable, and that's part of it. But if there's an insensitivity in the religious aspect as well,
Yeah.
this feels like sin. And I have clients routinely say this to me. I would rather die miserable with OCD
Mm.
than do a therapy that's going to make me sin against God.
Wow. Oof, that hurts me.
And
Wow.
so when I think about ERP as it's used in religious OCD specifically, I think of a couple key things. I think, first of all, it needs to be consensual. It has to be the therapist and the client working together to talk. And here's, I think, the most important question that a therapist could ever ask a person with religious OCD as they're trying to do ERP together. The question
Okay.
is, what does this mean for you and your belief system?
Okay.
Many people with scrupulosity are scared stiff to talk about their actual beliefs in the therapeutic setting because they're struggling with something. But especially for Christians, there's this idea of, I want to be a good witness for Jesus, and so I better not talk about this because it wouldn't be a good witness.
Mm.
So asking, well, can you tell me more? What does this mean for you? Like, what does your faith community view this as? And sometimes what we see is that there can be this package of fears, and some of them are just fears that aren't very logical. They're not really related to that person's belief system. And then there's some that are. I'll give you an example here. I worked with a guy that called me from inside of an inpatient OCD. I don't remember which one it was. It was an OCD specific inpatient center.
Okay.
And his care team had been working hard with him. He was in a completely debilitated state because of all of the stuff he was going through. And they were
Right.
like, we're going to discharge you and send you home if you don't get on board with our plan of treatment. And so his wife contacted me in a frenzy because she's like, this is our last hope. If he doesn't get help here, like, I don't know what to do. Please convince him to do the ERP. And
Oh
I
God.
met with him. And of course, it's not my job to convince anybody, but I met with him and he shared with me this whole list of things that his therapists were wanting him to commit to if he was going to stay in the program.
Mhm.
His big fear was the demonic realm.
Okay.
And he was just very nervous that he had blasphemous or intrusive thoughts about like vowing himself to the devil. But then there were all kinds of things around him demonically related that he was really, really scared of. And as we looked through the list, I saw that some of them, as a Christian, I believe were inappropriate. and some of them were completely fine. So I remember one,
Uh-huh.
for example, they wanted him to eat devil's food cake. Or what is it?
Because it
What's it
had
called?
the name.
Right,
Devil's
deviled
yeah,
eggs or something like that. I think it's
right.
angel food cake and devil's eggs. They
Angel
wanted
food cake,
deviled
deviled eggs.
eggs, right? Deviled eggs. And he would not eat deviled eggs because it had that name in it. And
Right.
so
That's
that was
that's
that was
like in Austin, we have Torchy's tacos, and it has a little devil as their symbol.
Mhm.
I've had people not be able to eat Torchy's tacos. They're so good, though.
Yeah, so something like that because there's a name association or, like, driving down a road that's called, like, Devil's Mountain Road.
Yeah, right.
It's just a name that somebody has labeled this road. It is not going to be it's not a spiritual statement for you to drive down this road, right? But then we
Yes.
started getting into some that I felt like, I don't think these are appropriate. For example, they wanted him to watch some movies that were, like, demonic movies.
Okay.
And, like, as a Christian, I would not watch those because I feel like there's a certain element here when you're absorbing that, you're opening
Yeah,
up your mind to different ideas that you
yeah.
don't want having in your mind.
Planting seeds, not no
Exactly.
bueno. Yeah.
And so there was that, and then I think if I remember correctly, there was part where he had to, like, write a script out of him, like, selling his soul to the devil, and these are the kind of things where I'm like, "Okay, I understand why they might be thinking these ideas up, but from
Yeah,
our belief system as Christians, these are
right.
not appropriate." The other,
Yeah,
yeah, go eat the deviled eggs, go drive down Devil's Mountain Road, and go ahead and feel the anxiety that you get and realize
right.
that, number 1, this fear is irrational, and we just talked through why it's irrational, and I trust the other people in my life telling me that it's irrational and I'm going to do this and get used to the fear. But the other things, if you can't really conscientiously say that your faith background is okay with that, I wouldn't do it and I wouldn't ask a client to do it. So there has to be that interest of like, what does this really mean for you and how safe is this for your belief system? I like what you said earlier about values. That having those values and whatever we're doing in the recovery process has to, like, help us reorient to those values without destroying them in the name of recovery.
Exactly. Right. Is the real good rule of thumb for ERP, if any therapist learning this is out there listening. If you want to be safe, is this something that you're asking them to do that they would normally do in their life and it would benefit, it bear fruit, right?
Mhm.
No? Or is it something that they're never ever going to do again in a million years outside of this treatment program? That probably is one you want to reconsider.
Right.
And I love what you said about being the coach and it being, what did you say, consensual or like
And I
it's
say
a
that because had clients that have come in and they have told me stories about how the program they were in or the therapist they worked with would try to force it. And they would say, "I'm
yes,
not gonna work with you anymore if you don't do this exact exposure."
that will never work. The key problem there is you cannot white knuckle exposures and get the results you're hoping for.
Right.
It causes more problems than it I don't even think it helps. But I'm really glad to hear that because I'm seeing ERP, the gold standard everywhere, especially since the pandemic. And so many online companies are now doing great work, but it's getting a lot of media. And I think that folks that have a poor experience with it, I like that you're saying, maybe that wasn't the right therapist for you or wasn't, someone that was very educated in this specific theme
Right.
because it can be helpful in certain realms. Your way of breaking that down to the three ways. This is something I want to tolerate. Say it one more time. I don't want to forget it.
Yeah, so remove what's hurting you.
Remove what's hurting you. Okay. Now that is
That means go
interesting.
to your trauma therapist.
Yes. And so a psychoanalytical approach, a trauma informed approach, which a lot of ERP therapists say that you should never do that. And I don't think that's true. I think it's spot on that for some things, actually talking about your past experiences and where you're pulling the logic from makes a lot of sense to uncover the roots of things and then give you a different vantage point and a different mindset. Oh, that might be why I'm doing it this way or thinking. And maybe it's not even my belief. It was someone else's belief. And, you
And
know,
I saw how that was so instrumental in my own recovery too, because as I started, thinking gently thinking my way through of like, why do I believe God is expecting this from me? Where am I getting
Mm,
it from? And then I began going through and realizing, I had these and these and these experiences growing up. I was very parentified. I had too much responsibility as a child. I wasn't
yeah.
given a safe emotional space to really express what I was really feeling. I was, it was almost inevitable that I would turn into this people pleasing, perfectionistic, self protective person. And as I mentioned earlier, he is a self protective disorder. And I had never really fully had that protection from outside of myself. So all I knew was protecting myself.
Mhm.
Right? And that's actually
Yeah.
a question that I ask my clients frequently. I like to take what I call the love history. I say, tell me about how you were loved growing up. What was it like for you growing up? Was love something that
Oh,
was free and safe, or did you feel that love had to be earned? Was love conditional? And many people, and I don't know how this would track out in other OCD themes because that's not my specialty, but
mhm.
specifically for people who are dealing with the religious obsessions and compulsions
Yes.
and distorted views of God and self, I see very frequently there's this element that love is conditional. I have to earn it. I have to be
Yeah.
perfect. And of course, that feeds into the moralistic, like, you know,
Right.
getting everything just right. And that is
Mhm.
not always pure biology of OCD. So
Sure.
again, I'm not a therapist. I always tell everybody, guys, I'm not a therapist, but let's just talk about from the spiritual side. Love is a spiritual thing. And how did you experience that love?
Oof, you got me in chills. I really feel like there's only two places we operate out of, and that's love or fear. I really do. Every client, and I've seen hundreds, and every time I walk them down, what's the imagined story that OCD is telling them is going to happen if they don't do the compulsion, and if they say what's just coming off the top of their head, and then I'm like, okay, and then what's the worst that could happen if that happened? We only have to go 2 or 3 more steps down the road and it ends up no one's going to love me. I'm going to be all alone. No
Yes.
matter what the theme is. It doesn't matter if it's cleanliness, which, people don't understand that myth of everybody that has OCD is just because they wash their hands all the time. It's not about I want clean hands. It's more about I don't want to cause harm by spreading a germ and hurting somebody else. And then I've caused harm to someone. And then, what if I get in trouble? What if people find out? How am I going to live with myself? And then when you think about spirituality, it's, what's God going to think about? I did something careless by not washing my hands and I made others sick, or I made myself sick and I'm not able to now provide for my family because I can't work and I'm going to lose the house. The stories they tell, they all lead down to, I need to protect myself or I'm not going to be loved and I'm going to be kicked out of the village.
And when you think about it, the number one story that people with religious OCD are telling themselves at the base and core of what happens next, what are you afraid of next, is to be lost eternally. And what does it mean to be lost? For a Christian, it means eternal separation from God's divine love.
That must feel very painful to think about.
Mhm.
And I wonder if folks that haven't experienced that, if they can identify with that fear. I don't know, but I can. And that's a scary thought. I can't
Yeah.
imagine one scarier.
Mhm.
Especially if you believe that if in your belief system you believe that you can reconnect with your loved ones at some point in time, and that's what a lot of us are hanging on to, that
Yeah.
day where we can
Right.
be free from all of this and back in with everyone. If we're afraid we're going to do some microscopic mistake here and that's going to be such a huge consequence, it's so easy to get caught up in the compulsions or the religiosity, right? The conditional love piece where I have to do these things perfectly, like pray perfectly or whatever it is, go to confession or whatever. The thought is I have to do these kinds of activities perfectly in order to get that love or that acceptance. Painful. Man, you're full of so much good information and examples. I know I've kept you and I really appreciate your time. I wanted just to mention your group coaching. briefly have talked about some of the services that you offered, and I just think it's amazing. Your group coaching says that you cover over 100 topics, and I briefly read through some of them. There's some good ones. Would you mind sharing a handful of some of the main topics that come up on the regular that our listeners might say, oh gosh, I need to tune into that?
Yeah, so I have like a 2-year rotating curriculum of topics, and
2 years of topics?
because I need
Wow.
one per week, right?
You got
Um,
two a week.
2 per week, but
Yeah?
we cover the same topic on Sunday and Wednesday because people have different time zones and different schedules.
Oh, great. Okay.
But I think some of the most regularly we talk about our relationship with God and how to free that from the shackles of obsessive compulsive ritualization, how to really return to having a vibrant relationship with Jesus rather than something of like, I have to, or I'm going to be disowned and permanently, sent away from his presence. So how to restore that relationship? We talk about dealing with our emotions. There's a lot in the Bible about how we can, in a healthy way, deal with our emotions. We talk about things like control. Many of us have a
Mm,
very ordered relationship with control and
yeah.
responsibility. We talk about doubt. Doubt is a very concerning thing to many Christians with OCD, but I make the case from scripture that uncertainty is actually one of the highest forms of faith that we can have. To follow Jesus when I don't understand all the nuances, to follow what he's telling me, even when I don't feel sure about it. That is, I believe, there's a lot of evidence in the Bible that that's faith. And so we
That's what
talk
I was gonna ask you. I was like, that's how I would define faith right there.
right. So we talk about uncertainty and the chronic doubt that OCD tries to threaten us with. And then we get also into some of the more nitty-gritty applications of, okay, this is what OCD actually looks like in the religious life. So we talk about things like evangelism compulsions, fasting compulsions. Interesting case study. I had a pastor who was going through what he thought was demonic spiritual warfare because he had had this sudden onset of OCD in his midlife. As a pastor, like, what do you do when you're having scrupulosity and you're still responsible for like preaching to your flock? And, it was really a major crisis for him. And so somehow his family was saying, like, hey, it might be something called scrupulosity. So he joined our group. And it just so happened that the first or second session that he was with us, I did a group session on fasting compulsions. And this was a major thing that he'd been dealing with. And it was like,
Oh my
jaw
gosh.
drop. He realized, okay, it was that insight in a moment. He's like, this is me. This is what I have. I'm going to work on this from a scrupulosity perspective rather than a spiritual warfare perspective. And I've heard from him lately, and he's doing great. His OCD is really well under control. Anyways, like, so we talk about some of these things that I think can help to build insight with people. Confession
Yes.
compulsions, prayer compulsions. I mean, there's so many different ones out there. And then we talk about the rebuilding process. Okay, going to church. This is what going to church should look like in a healthy way. Praying. This is what praying should look like when it's not surrounded by all of these compulsions. So we have quite a broad topic base, but ultimately what my goal is to help people to restore that relationship with God in a way that's going to be healthy and fruitful, as you've
Yeah.
mentioned, and just to help them. I also harp a lot every chance that I get about, again, trying to integrate the different, the psychological interventions with the spiritual perspectives, because I do find, and again, I don't know if this is common across all the different themes of OCD, but in religious OCD, there's a big bias against traditional therapy. And I think it's really unfortunate because therapists like yourself and many others have so many things to help with OCD. I think because of the spiritual nature, people are so scared to talk about it to somebody who's not precisely in the same spiritual bubble that they're in, or fears of ERP. So I always try to encourage that, like, try, guys, try. If it didn't go well, try a different therapist, try again.
Mm,
And so just I
yeah.
think having those discussions can be helpful.
Gosh, yes. I'm wondering how can we like help folks that feel like it's against their religion to get therapy? I don't know how. I think in inviting the client with their spiritual leader, I've always tried to do that if there's an option. Yeah, I don't know. What advice do you have for people struggling with that?
Yeah, that can be tough. I think that approach can possibly backfire in some cases.
I think it could. And I always want to meet with that person one-on-one before I invite them into the conversation, because a lot
Right.
of times they don't know anything about OCD. The spiritual leader has
Right.
never even heard of scrupulosity.
That's the most common issue. I had a client one time that she went to church, and I think it wasn't her home church, but she walked in and sat down, and the preacher was saying, "If you take an antidepressant medication, that is a lack of faith." And she said she got up and walked out of the church
Good for
because
her.
not every spiritual leader
Yeah.
understands that, we're not just these disembodied spirits. Like, we live in a real body. The Bible talks about how God has, even in the book of Genesis, when you look at what is a soul, Genesis chapter 2, it says that God formed man of the dust of the earth. That's the
Mm,
biological, physical component. And he breathed into man the breath of life. That's spirit. And then it says he became a living soul. That's a holistic unit of a unified component of I am my body, I am my spirit. I'm not fully flesh and I'm not fully spirit. I'm a combination of both. And sometimes
yeah.
one part can malfunction and sometimes the other part can malfunction. And
Hmm.
so I need to be aware that this thing up here can have struggles. It can need surgery, it can need medication, it can need a lot of different things. So, yeah, if a faith leader doesn't have that holistic understanding of biblical anthropology, I would call it,
Right.
um,
Okay.
it can be complicated to have this discussion at all.
How would a religious leader learn? Do you have any resources? How did you teach yourself? Like, how would they?
I taught myself of the pure necessity that I was struggling with it.
Yeah. Okay.
So, how to educate yourself, retracking on this question. I know there are a lot of resources out there for, I think there's a whole journal for religion and mental health, an academic journal on religion and mental health. But just, I think, researching more on biblical anthropology. Who are we as people? Recognizing the holistic nature of how God made us, and that there are so many misconceptions about mental health within Christianity. I don't know, specifically in other religions, but I know in Christianity, misconceptions about mental health. It's really a major thing. So I think, there's a lot of resources available now. We live in the time of
Yeah.
the age of information. It's there when a person is willing to look for it.
Oh, for someone in the grip of something like this right now that might be listening, what would be your advice or something you'd like them to know or share with?
Yeah. So someone in the grips of this absolutely would say there is hope to get better from this. And I have seen it in so many of my clients. I mean, you can go online and hear other people's success stories as well. OCD is not a death sentence. Even religious OCD, and many people with religious OCD feel as though they've been forsaken by God, that they're cast out of presence, that they've committed the unpardonable sin. I mean, and there's often such a sense of finality. I don't know how many of your clients have talked with you about like the unpardonable sin. That's like a big
I
one.
was wondering, what is that
Mhm.
exactly?
That's a very big topic. Maybe we'll save that for our next
Okay.
time we meet. But many people have this idea that they've done the unpardonable, that there's this sort of termination clause between them and God, and they have just done it. And it's a hopeless place to be. That the
Yeah.
one thing that you want most, which is to spend eternity with your Lord, has been taken from you by weird thoughts that you're like, I don't even know where this came from. Hopeless. It's a hopeless, hopeless feeling to have. But I just want to say to anybody who's listening to this that has experienced that, it feels hopeless, but it's not hopeless. And I have seen so many people come through the gauntlet of that and have this period where they feel like it all is lost. And somehow the mind begins to recalibrate. And over a period of time, they realize this was my brain tormenting me. And this had nothing to do with God at all. And so, yeah, I think that's a good perspective to have, is to remind ourselves that this might not be God, this might be my brain. And let me just hang in there a little bit longer. Let me give my best shot to treatment. And the other thing that I'll say is, I often will remind people that this is my personal opinion, purely my opinion. I have no longitudinal studies to back this up. But my opinion here is that the biggest predictor for healing from OCD is courage.
Hmm.
I see that the people that have courage and they say, I think I can. I think I can. I think I can. Just like the little engine that could in the children's book, right? I think I can
Yeah.
do this. By the grace of God, I can do this. And they put their mind and their back into it. These are the people that I see getting better, the people who bring courage to the table. So don't be
And
discouraged.
yeah,
Keep trying.
love that.
Yeah.
And courage and doesn't mean doing the therapy perfectly or anything. It means, in my world, it means going towards the things you value and that, bear the fruit and are loving despite the anxiety alongside. You don't
Right.
have to wait for it to go away. You don't have to stop your entire life and try to work on this one thing. The more that you continue to go out and do the things that you love to do and be with the people and community that you love while the OCD is working its way out, that's courageous.
Yeah.
That's so courageous. I think I remember the question. It's just maybe a topic for another visit, but when people totally turn away from religion because they're dealing with scrupulosity and they abandon it 100%, do you have any words of wisdom for them if they happen to stumble upon this podcast?
Yeah, that's a very sensitive question for two reasons. First of all, the people who experience that, I think, live with a burden of shame and possibly regret because they are turning away from something that at their core, the OCD attacks what we value most. So it means it was something
Right.
valuable to them. At the same time,
Yes.
I think it's a very sensitive question because many of the people who do have an active case of scrupulosity are very terrified of what you just mentioned. They're afraid that they will do that. That
Okay.
and especially because so I see that there tends to be like a pendulum swing in
Yes.
scrupulosity. You know,
Hmm.
I'm doing everything my mind tells me to, and then they swing into the avoidance because it
Yes.
becomes too painful for them. And it's specifically people who are in that avoidance stage where they're like, I can't go to church, I can't read my Bible, I can't pray, this is just all too much, it's making me so anxious.
Yeah.
And especially if they start feeling like negative or angry thoughts towards God, they'll think,
Hmm.
what if I am going to deconvert or walk away from my faith? And that can become a whole nother sort of spiral of fears of things that might happen to them. I would say in the people that I've worked with, I haven't seen that happening. I know that that demographic does exist, but at least the people I've worked with, I can only think of really maybe one person out of a few hundred that I've worked with that was, expressive of saying like, I'm just done. I can't do this anymore. And so, yeah, that does become quite a topic of anxiety for for Christians with OCD. But even if a person has come to a place where they're no longer practicing, doesn't mean that God's not still waiting for them. Doesn't mean that God doesn't still love them.
Mm.
And one of my favorite passages in the Bible is in Hosea chapter 14, verse 4, where God is talking to the nation of Israel when they've backslidden, they've walked away from him, they're, burning incense to these idols and doing like basically everything God told them not to do, sacrificing their children in the fire and just terrible atrocities. And Hosea 14, verse 4, he says, I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely. My anger is turned away from them. And it's an invitation. The whole chapter is this invitation to come back. God's not mad at you. Come back and experience that relationship that he intended for you to have. And I think that it doesn't really matter at what point we are in, thinking about walking away or walking away. We can always turn around and come back.
That's beautiful. Really beautiful. Do you ever encourage people to read the Serenity Prayer?
This is a very nice one. I can't say that I've memorized it or
Right,
mentioned it
right, right.
specifically, but I'm familiar. It's a very nice one.
Yes, just to have the discernment to know what you can control and what you cannot, since it's such a control disorder.
Right.
Well, I'm curious, how does someone come and sign up for your group? Is it open enrollment, or do you have
Yeah,
certain periods of time?
so my website is scrupulosity.com, and you can sign up there for the group coaching set. Well, I have like a membership package where I have the master class that I filmed, and I just refilmed it. It's almost done being edited, and it's going to be uploaded soon. And I'm really excited because I added a whole lot more stuff in the 2.0 version of my masterclass. So you'll get
Awesome.
access to it's around 8 or 10 hours of content of like, here's some core principles for scrupulosity recovery. And then we have every Sunday evening and Wednesday afternoon, we have group coaching sessions on Zoom. There's also a forum for peer support. I mentioned earlier that peer support forums were very instrumental in my own recovery, and so I wanted to reproduce that on my website as well. I usually am doing some limited amount of private coaching, but I am actually this month starting maternity leave, as I've shared with you. So I'm putting that on hold for a little while as we welcome our second baby. But yeah, hopefully by summer of this year, 2026, I'll be back to private coaching as well.
So you'll still be doing the groups?
I'll be continuing the group sessions throughout. Yeah.
Okay. That's so wonderful. Thank you for offering that. I think I'll take your master class because I'm sure that you have lots of nuggets in there I could still learn.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Okay. So, and you have a YouTube channel. That's amazing. I just want to throw that out there. Oh, I think it's great. There's a lot of little nuggets, bite-sized pieces of information that I think people could find very, very, I'm sure they find it very helpful. Yeah. I really appreciate you being a guest. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think I should have asked you?
No, I think you've really covered the ground quite well. I agree. I think we could talk for 3-4 hours, but thank you so much for the privilege of inviting me on your podcast. I really appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, look forward to visiting with you again soon. I really
Thank
do.
you, Samantha. Thank you so much.
Take care, Jaimie.
Thanks again, Jaimie, for a great conversation. If you take one thing from today, I hope it's this: a tormenting thought is not a verdict, and it's not truth. And as Jaimie reminded us, the single biggest predictor of healing is not doing therapy perfectly. It is courage, that quiet, repeated choice to keep moving toward the life and the faith you love, even while the anxiety rides along beside you. And if today's conversation stirred something in you, here's my one invitation. I would love to hear about your OCD journey. Your experience could be exactly what helps someone else feel less alone. And you can apply to share it on the show. And if you have a question you would like answered, you can send that in too, in writing or as a short voice memo, all at ocdinsights.com/asksam. And please like and subscribe. This helps more people find their way here. Take good care. Until next time.